to our second session. My name is Robin Wright, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm particularly honored to be affiliated with, I think, the two think tanks in Washington that do the most in drawing attention to women's issues across the board. The Woodrow Wilson Center, under the leadership of Holly Esfandiari and Jane Harmon, and the U.S. Institute of Peace, under the leadership of Kathleen Kunis, who I believe is here as well. Yes, in the back. We have one extra speaker and a little bit less time than the last panel, so I'm going to be a field marshal in enforcing a 12-minute with a 2 minutes, I mean it, warning for everyone. It's a particularly interesting cross-section of views this morning. We have, first of all, Rand al-Rahim, who everyone will remember as the first face of Iraq in the aftermath of the U.S. intervention. She's a former Iraqi ambassador to the United States and executive director of the Iraq Foundation. She is one of the most familiar faces worldwide, I think, on the issue of Iraq and also women's issues. Then Rola Dashti, who is an old friend, former member of the Kuwaiti parliament. I regret to say former. She's also chairman of the Kuwaiti Economic Society, and such a vibrant voice on issues on the situation of women throughout the Gulf, particularly. Carol Murphy is a Pulitzer Prize-winning former Washington Post correspondent for her coverage of the Gulf War 20 years ago, and she's currently a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And last but not least, Ragita da Silva de Alves, who is the Director of International Human Rights Policy at the Wellesley Center for Women. Each one is going to speak on one area to begin with, and then Ragita will wrap up by looking at lessons from post-conflict communities, I think, worldwide. So let's begin with Rand, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin, and likewise I would like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Middle East Program, and Hala, thank you so much for your inspirational work here at the center. First of all, yes, we are going to be speaking about our own subject, but there is a great deal of overlap. And as I was listening to the first panel, I was thinking, yes, you know, these things occur in Iraq, these things occur in Iraq, I've seen this and I've seen that. But perhaps it's a good idea to start with Iraq in a way as a country, because arguably we have had an awakening, not self-driven, but a revolution. Let's call it a revolution. And it is probably the first true revolution in Iraq that has happened, because it has completely changed not only the political faces, but also caused a social upheaval in the entire structure of the country. So Iraq is the first country that experienced a revolution in the region. And in 2003, what I would say is that this revolution unleashed huge possibilities, huge potential, huge opportunities, and huge expectations. And there were many sectors in society that were eager to seize as much as possible of this potential, of these possibilities, and whose expectations for success were very high. One of these groups was, of course, women's groups. They were there at the forefront right from the beginning of 2003, talking about women's rights, talking about freedoms and rights generally, but especially women's rights. And Iraq, like Egypt, we, you know, in a way we have a similar history, somewhat like Tunisia, but from the 1940s and 50s, Iraq had a very strong women's movement. We had one of the, perhaps the first women minister in 1959. I think we preceded Egypt in having a woman minister. So we had a very vibrant women's movement, recognition of women's rights, not only in terms of family law and so on, but also in the public sphere. That had declined in the 1980s, definitely, certainly in the 1990s. So women were eager to regain that. But in addition to the women, there were also Islamic parties, and there were also, and ominously I would say even more than the Islamic parties, there were tribes that were eager to seize the opportunity to gain back some of the power that they had lost in previous decades, really since the 1960s. So in a way, there was sort of a grab at positioning. There were expectations for gaining power. There was a potential for people to position themselves. And I would say that from 2003 to 2005, women did very well. There was a very strong women's movement. I take pride in saying that I was part of it. One of the first things that women managed to do, we have a personal status law in Iraq called Law 188, which was passed in 1959. It is an exemplary law in the region. I would like to say that it is as good as the Mudawwana that was created much later in the Maghreb. It is a combination of different madhahib in Islam. It doesn't sort of leave Islam, but it takes what's best for the woman. Well, there was a move by some clerics in 2003, 2004 to cancel to repeal the law, and the women's movement stood staunchly against the repeal, and fortunately they won. We still have that law. Another great victory, and I think the greatest and the one with the most enduring effect, is the 25% quota that we obtained in the Constitution. I know there are many people who question the usefulness of a quota, and many people say, what's the point of having a quota and having 25% if 90% of the women who get to Parliament through the quota are not good anyway? That is not the case. A quota is good because it shows women in action, it brings the face of women into the public domain, and it is a way of changing social and cultural perceptions of women and their role in the public arena. Quotas were our greatest achievement in the Constitution. I should also say that the Constitution, almost all the articles of the Constitution that talk about lack of discrimination always mention that there shall be no discrimination based on gender, It's always gender, etc. This was one of the things that women got into the Constitution. Also in 2004, 2005, we had 4 women ministers, unprecedented in Iraq, probably in the Middle East. But after the writing of the Constitution in 2005, there was a retreat. In 2005, the Islamic parties came to power in a big way. The elections of December 2005 created a mega bloc of Islamist parties. In fact, several blocks, but there was one huge bloc. And unfortunately, these Islamic parties made common cause with a resurgent tribal culture as well. And the tribes were very strong. And somebody talked about the conflation of Islam and culture and conservatism. In Iraq, tribes represented that conservatism, that culture, and the conflation led to a very strict interpretation of Islamic law at some levels of society, not all levels of society, but at some levels in society, and as many of the first panel mentioned, more so in the rural and semi-rural areas than in the urban environment. The problem with that immediately reflected on women, so that things like polygamy. Hala mentioned polygamy. Polygamy is legal in Iraq, but very constrained within Law 188 that I mentioned. After 2005, polygamy became much looser, much more prevalent, and the law, in fact, sort of turned a blind eye to polygamy. The urfi marriage, the unregistered marriages, increased substantially. Unfortunately, in Shiaism, there's something called mut'a marriage. That became very prevalent, especially in southern Iraq.
Temporary marriage.
Temporary marriage, yes, thank you. Child marriages. Again, child marriages are illegal in Iraq. But again, there were child marriages and recorded cases on the increase. Honor killings were on the increase throughout the country. Something that Iraq never had, female circumcision, was introduced to Iraq after 2005. It's not common, but it now happens in certain communities. giving girls to settle tribal and clan disputes, the fasl, was again revived. All of these are illegal. Gender-based violence on the increase. The Constitution bans all of these things. The laws ban them. But unfortunately, laws in the environment that we have, this highly conservative, Islamist come tribal culture that we have, the laws are not enforced. And women, even those women who know that they can get legal redress, are afraid to go to the law because of the repercussions on them, their children, and so on. The quota system now has produced 83 women in the Iraqi parliament, 83 out of 325 parliamentarians. And I want to add also in the provincial councils, which are elected, we have an average of 25% of women. Now, this sounds very good, and I just mentioned that I'm in favor of the quota system. The problem, of course, is that not all women are in favor of women's rights. And we have to distinguish here about what we mean by women's rights, because I think particularly women who are allied or who are elected through Islamic parties make a distinction between women's rights to be in the public domain, to be members of parliament, to be ministers, and so on, because that's not affected by Sharia. But when it comes to issues that are affected by Sharia, they suddenly become extremely conservative, unwilling to support women's rights. For example, there are women, oh good grief, there are women in parliament who support polygamy in a much looser way than we have. There are women in the provincial councils who will not go to council meetings without having their husband or their brother or their son go with them, what's called a mahram. Now, if you are in fact in a decision-making position and you still think you need a male relative to go with you, it makes a mockery of your perception of yourself as a public figure, a decision maker. We have a schism in Iraq now between women in parliament who are in favor of women's rights and all rights, and women who are in favor of rights selectively. There has been no movement on major legislation that has to do with women. We have 1,300,000 widows in Iraq who are perhaps the poorest of the poor. They support families. Many of them are also internally displaced persons, and they have no fixed abode. They don't have access to ration cards. Their children don't have access to schools. Their situation is pathetic. There has been no legislation to help these women. Before I get completely cut off, I want to simply say that there is hope on the horizon. And where will it come from? First of all, there have been women's alliances made in Iraq between secular women and women from religious parties. But they are not sort of grand caucuses and coalitions. They are alliances on specific issues. And these alliances have been lobbying very hard with the government, with parliament, and so on. They agree on a particular item, and they forget the things, they leave aside the things that they don't agree on. And that has been a good policy. Second, 1 minute. NGOs. Women's NGOs have been very vocal, very active, and have lobbied, have advocated, have printed, have published, have done research, and their voice is heard. And finally, women are beginning to address themselves to men. And I think until and unless you grab with you as many men as possible, I don't think we can make that social revolution that will eventually affect the political policy making and decision making.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to make one little comment about the quota system. International Republican Institute did a poll in Tunisia last summer, and one of the questions they asked was, how do you feel about giving half of the seats in parliament to women. And the result was quite interesting. 53% said that was too high, but 41% said it was just right. I'm not sure we'd get 41% in this country if we put it to the vote. So on that note, Rola, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Robin. And I would like to thank Hala for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. If I had to change the title, and I will ask, after the Arab Awakening, are women exclusion is there, not marginalization? I'm a person who's very much concerned about what I'm seeing so far with the Arab Awakening, especially when it comes to women's rights. No question women were marginalized during repressive regimes. And the World Economic Forum ranked the best country in the Arab region, ranked 103 in gender gap when it comes to economic, political, and social rights. 103 out of 135 countries. And the last one was Yemen. The first one was 103 was Emirates, UAE, followed by Kuwait, then 108 is Tunisia, and the last country, 135, was Yemen. So you can tell how much we were marginalized with all the gains that we have made throughout the last 3 decades. But now I'm worried about these gains. And I'm seeing exclusion is going there. And we're going in the path of exclusion. And the more worry I have is because what we're seeing with the Islamist, political Islamizations, that is in control. I don't believe when it comes to social rights of women that there is modernization in political Islamization. And the reason for this is there's no places in the Arab region, even in Muslim words, I can tell, that the Salafist, radicalist Islamist, and the Muslim Brotherhood were in power together. And you see how they will function. Except a small example was in Kuwait, where we have both of them in power in the parliament. And this is, you want to see what's going to happen when we talk about women's rights and social rights of women. Radicalist Islamists, the Salafists, their agenda is the social rights. And their agenda is, when it comes to role of women, it's private sphere, full stop. And if we want her to go, she will go to the what we call the traditional jobs, teachers, administrator, and go back. Because they need the husband's household income, the family income households, they need the wife's income. So whenever there is an extremist, any draft laws that is presented, you will not see Muslim brotherhoods coming and become moderate. And they say, no, this is not right. They will go with them. So if my agenda is to have the women go back to the house because of religion, and that's her role, they will end up voting for this, and they will not fight it. If we want to go into the issue of reversing also domestic violence or something like that, they will go to the extremist side. The family law will go there. Women getting into the public offices, which is perceived as men's job, and for some of these radical Islamists is unreligious, okay, they will drift the Muslim Brotherhood into this. And we have been seeing it. Actually, we've been seeing how much women who played a pivotal role during the revolution, what happened during transitional councils, during new governments and parliaments. You heard some of our friends were they saying the deterioration into it. But we haven't seen nothing yet. Now we have double work. One, to maintain the gains we made and to move forward. And we can't keep our eyes blind a little bit because you can't trust them. These groups are beneficiaries, the political Islamizations are beneficiaries of revolutions. They haven't started it. It's the youth and the women who started it, and everybody saw. If you saw in Tunisia, you saw in Egypt, the faces in Libya, the faces of moderate, liberal people, civil people who are asking for justice, freedom, and human dignity. And the faces are like everyone else, which everybody shares with them, that these are individuals, that they have the right to live in decency. But then what's the outcome? We saw new faces. I personally never heard that 25% of the Egyptian populations are Salafists. From where on earth did they come? You know, and now we're seeing a rise in Tunisia. Look in Libya. Abdel Jalil, a very nice, modern person, who is the head of the Transitional Council. In his first speech, of the victory speech, what did he say? He said, we're going to have polygamy, we're going to make it acceptable, and we're going to turn the country into Sharia Islamists. As if the revolution in Libya was for polygamy. It's just amazing. And this is where, and because they will not deliver, a lot of people knows that they will not deliver on the economic issues, that people's expectation, they will use the women issues to polarize society. And this is what worries me. Because when you come to speak about any issue related to women, society gets to be polarized. And they will use it to engage society and drift them from the main issues. And this is a very big worry I get to be concerned about what's going on. Talking about women, to tell you how much they want to segregate and exclude women. Recent MPs in Egypt, when journalists were coming, he was saying, no, we don't have to have one door for all the male and female journalists to enter from. So we have to have separate doors for female journalists. You see, little things which we take easy, they're not easy because they will build on social segregation. And then it makes it worse to get more rights. In Kuwait, for example, I heard Lily was talking about women ministry affairs. And this is the place where you segregate women from society. In Kuwait, because they weren't able to have women ministry affairs because we have a limited number by constitution of number of ministers into it. So they submitted draft laws of what they call women's civil and social rights. And they wanted to have a specific clause for women, which includes, for example, women in, for example, we're talking about women who are working, maternity leaves, delivery rights, for example, or housing rights, or, for example, residency for children of women. And we said, why is it a law separate? So when we were in Parliament, because we were in charge of the women committee, the 4 MPs, we said, no, we will go to every single law and change the existing law. For example, we're talking about maternity leave, delivery leaves for women. We will go to the Civil Commission law, the labor law, and we change the law. We're talking about residency, we'll go to the residency law, we change the law. Health issues, we'll go to the health law. Housing issues, we go, because she's part of she's part of the society. So you just make her not to segregate her. And it was a big fight. Do we have a one law or amending separate laws that are existing in her? And it was a very big battle. You can see this little thing. Is it one law or amending the laws into it? Because the thinking is segregating women within society. And this gets to be worrying. And that's what we're seeing across the region, what's going on. It's the same methodology they use, whether they were in Kuwait or they're going to be going in Egypt or Tunisia or Libya or wherever it is. And this is what worries me about. And what worries me about, I will finish, is that when we look at these revolutions, I don't think in the world, when I examine at least what I have seen, that after the revolution, religion plays a very big political power, is a very big political power. In our region, the religion is a political power by getting these political Islamizations into it. And they play a big role into the whole shaping of the social structure. I do worry where we're going. I do worry, I don't know what they're going to do with tourism in Tunisia and Egypt when we talk about economic issues. We're talking about alcohol and drinking and stuff like that. Where would this is income, and this is haram, and income from alcohol is haram, and I don't know what the Salafists will do, and how would they drift the society into the thing. People say, let's try them. It's democracy. Yes, it's democracy. Unfortunately, democracy is not only voting, but these people, they didn't have any alternative. They don't know anything except Islamists who they used to serve them, where the governments were not seeing the needs of their citizens. So they are the outcome. I said, you try them? Who told you we will have a second fair elections next round? This is, I think, we will be very cynical if we think with them they will redraft the election laws, the constitution, to ensure that they will last forever. And the idea of having an issue of a fair election, I think we are just misguiding. So this is why I say we have a lot of work to do. I do worry about the international community. Previously, the international community, when they're dealing with our region, they traded democracy for stability, and now I worry that they will trade our women's social rights and dignity for cooperation. And the issue is that we have a long way to go. So we will be fighting now. It's another struggle. I think we have to fight for the security of our dignity as women in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rola. And Carol now will talk about Saudi Arabia.
Good morning. I think of all the panelists that are here today, I perhaps have the most ironic topic, which is Saudi women in the wake of the Arab Awakening. It's ironic because while women elsewhere in the MENA region fear a loss of their rights and a diminishing of their empowerment as a result of the Islamist political surge, women in Saudi Arabia have been living under an Islamist regime for centuries. And frankly, rather than setbacks, Saudi women have only one direction to move, and that's up. Way before the Arab Awakening, they already had it pretty bad when it comes to personal freedoms and participation in the public sphere. My topic's also ironic because whatever forward steps or bright spots we see regarding women in Saudi Arabia, they've been made possible by the ruler, the top man, King Abdullah, who obviously, by most definitions, qualifies as an Islamist ruler. But it's his decisions in recent years, since he became king in 2005, some of which I'll discuss shortly, that have been giving women the advances that they're seeing. Just a few days ago, you may have read, he fired another senior cleric who pushed back publicly against the king's reformist agenda in the area of women. And these decisions of the king have won him the deep love, believe me, I'm not exaggerating, of the vast majority of Saudi women. So what was the Arab Awakening's impact in Saudi when it comes to women? I would say that it's brought inspiration, enthusiasm, and energy to many women, but I won't say all. This has led to increased female activism and some improvements. The example of women elsewhere getting their rights, at least initially, has made many Saudi women say, we see that we can get something done. So what's the most prominent example of these achievements since the Arab Awakening? Well, I think it was last year's driving campaign, in which in one day more than 60 Saudi women in locations all over the country drove cars to protest the ban on female drivers. Was it a success? Yes, according to Carol. The ban's still there, but you've never had 60 women do something in public in Saudi protesting a restriction. We know there are about 60 because they videotaped themselves doing it, put it on YouTube, and then tweeted what they'd done. Secondly, since the Arab Awakening, women are far more active on Twitter and Facebook in the debates about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. You know, what's good for this country, what's bad, how should we change, how should we not change. Thirdly, there have been 2 university protests at university campuses against the restrictions on them. These were very mundane things like a dirty campus or I can't bring my cell phone to class. And they were both started by women. Now I have to add that even before the Arab Awakening, there were 2 campaigns started by Saudi women for improvements. One was for fairer divorce laws, and this is now currently before the Majlis. And the second was to get the right to vote. So what has been the effect of the Arab Awakening on the government? Because you've got to go, there's two actors here, people and government. Well, it made them realize that, hey, we better do something. So you've all read what they've done as far as giving out money, but what have they done regarding women? Well, first of all, was their response to the driving campaign. Now, I know you all read about the women who were arrested and taken to the police station. Even one woman, by a very recalcitrant judge, was ordered to be lashed, which she never was. The verdict was not carried out. But overall, the response was very soft. It was very obvious that the police had orders from the top, don't interfere with these women. Close your eyes, look the other way. Secondly, the king made 2 royal decrees last September. One was giving women the right to compete as candidates and to vote in the next municipal elections in 2015. Now, granted, these are toothless political organizations, but it's the first time women have been given equal political privileges to men in the kingdom. It's a very symbolic thing. The second thing the king said last September was that he was planning to appoint women to the Majlis, which is currently an all-male advisory body. Now, we don't know how many women he's going to appoint, who these women will be, or even if they'll be allowed to be in the same room with the men. We don't know all those details yet. But again, it was another symbolic step forward for women in the political sphere. More importantly, the Labor Ministry has made it an even higher priority since the Arab Awakening to get Saudi women, who now make up over 60% of university graduates, a job. And you may have read recently that there was a royal decree banning men from being sales clerks in lingerie shops anymore. But let's suffice it to say, the bottom line is the Ministry of Labor is pushing very, very hard to reduce female unemployment, especially among young women. Lastly, I'd mention the recent declaration of the new head of the religious police that the women will not be harassed anymore for not covering their faces. It's de rigueur that every Saudi woman should cover her hair, but the thing about the face is debatable. Some agree, some don't. So the last announcement was religious police will no longer be allowed to harass women for not covering their face. When I went to Saudi Arabia in 2008, there was nothing like a women's movement. But 4 years later, I would have to say we're seeing the beginnings of such a movement. And again, it's been a result not only of a higher consciousness among women, but because the top man is behind all this. And there's another thing I should mention, that there's been a very strong movement to a fight against domestic violence and child abuse in Saudi Arabia that has been the king's agenda also. And his daughter, Princess Adila, is the one who's in charge of that. So the Arab Awakening has given Saudi women encouragement, and they really do admire what women in the rest of the MENA region have done. At the same time, they're not in favor of the same kind of tactics, i.e. street protests or open confrontation. There's a widespread feeling among Saudi women that working behind the scenes is the most effective way for them to get change and improve their lot. Secondly, I have the observation that I don't see a strong desire for assistance from the outside or for coordination with other non-Saudi women. Perhaps this is because Saudi women feel a bit that their situation is rather unique and needs specific tactics. Moreover, notwithstanding all the Saudi women you're reading on Twitter and seeing in Facebook being very hard on the need for change, there's still a very low level of political consciousness among Saudi women. Many still say they're very happy with their situation and nothing has to be changed. On my recent trip there, just last month, I had one group interview with about 20 school teachers. Most of them in their 20s and early 30s. Of course, most of them were married. And when I asked what was wrong that should be fixed regarding women in Saudi, there was complete silence for about a whole minute until one woman finally said, "Nothing. We're very happy the way things are." There's a very low tolerance for female activism. One woman who drove was fired from her job with a government charity. And another woman who decided to get active in the campaign to get women to vote, she was told she had to choose between her job at a women's economic training center and her activism. The good thing is that she chose her activism. Finally, I would say that success, particularly in Egypt, over the next 5 to 8 years, as far as women's rights go, if it's non-violent success, it's going to have a great impact in Saudi Arabia. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, very much. Just one note, one of my favorite books to read about what women are thinking is The Girls from Riyadh. And for anyone who hasn't read it, it's out in paperback in English, and it's a delicious read, and you really get a sense of what life is like behind the veil, one way or another. And another one of my favorite stories is about, I think her name is Hisa Halal, who, niqab-wearing mother of 4, who entered something called the Million Poets competition, which is the American Idol of the Persian Gulf. It has broadcast to 300 million people. And she was competing in, they weren't allowed to sing, but they recited poetry that they wrote. And she wrote an amazing poem and got up on stage all by herself, covered in niqab, and read this fiery poem against radical clerics and radical fatwas. And as she gained more and more applause, she then started reciting her poetry against her countrymen and women who tolerated the radical clerics and the radical fatwas. And it was just a little microcosm of the many fields that women are increasingly active. And now we go to the broader world with Rangita.
Thank you, Robin. I want to begin by first invoking the wisdom of the Iranian Nobelist Shirin Ebadi, who said recently, "A revolution is not all about toppling a dictator. Fulfilling a revolution's democratic promises and the institutionalization of democracy are the main aims of a revolution." So as we all know, transitions provide powerful windows of opportunity to address deep-seated gender inequalities and to reevaluate the status of women in both in politics and in development. It also provides an opportunity to recast constitutions and legal frameworks and provides multiple opportunities for transformation on many different levels. So the opportunities for transformation are, in theory, open-ended, and in particular hold significant impact and potential for transformation for women. I want to share some panoramic snapshots of other transitional justice processes and try to identify some of the tools that might be instructive for the women in the Arab world in their way forward. Constitutions, as we know, embody a country's values, historical experiences, its memories, and most importantly, a sense of forward-looking strategies for nation building. Constitutions are also important moments in history because they provide a fresh start for a community. And these constitutions have tremendous symbolic and substantive promise. Constitutional reform is deeply important, especially in post-conflict societies, because it provides for means of addressing previous flaws in constitutions and in rule of law. For example, in the Rwandan Constitution of 2003, the preamble enshrines these words: "We, the people of Rwanda, are resolved to fight the ideology of genocide and all its manifestations, and to eradicate ethnic, regional, and any other form of divisions. And we are determined to fight dictatorship by putting in place democratic institutions and leaders freely elected by ourselves." These are powerful words. Secondly, transitional justice processes must be marked by allegiance to international law and human rights, including the CEDAW. The CEDAW, as we all know, is a critical bulwark in the fight for the advancement of women's rights, especially in a democratizing Arab world. Now, as we know, and was mentioned in the morning, both Morocco and Tunisia have raised their reservations to the CEDAW. Jordan has raised some of its reservations, but is yet to raise its reservations on equal nationality rights for women. So many governments in the region need to take further steps to align their national laws with existing international commitments under the CEDAW, but women's rights activists have the burden of holding their governments accountable to the CEDAW as well as the CEDAW's concluding observations. As important as the CEDAW is the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which provides critical language which reinforces the significance of gender throughout transitional justice processes and mandates that member states ensure increased representation of women at all decision-making levels for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. Several countries ensure the primacy and the supremacy of international law by enshrining them in their constitutions. Again, going to Rwanda, Rwanda reaffirms in its preamble the adherence to the principles of human rights enshrined in the United Nations Charter and all 7 core human rights treaties, including the CEDAW. More importantly, the South African Constitution is one of the few examples that provides for a constitutionally mandated entity created by a transitional justice process that provided for a Commission for Gender Equality, whose functions include promoting respect for gender equality and the protection, development, and advancement of gender equality. While the Commission's impact has been limited and the full exploration of the Commission is beyond the scope of this analysis, it shows how innovative constitutional design can anchor gender in ways that are helpful in centralizing and mainstreaming women into political and public life. A month ago, Liberia celebrated the launch of the long-awaited Children's Law, which marked a legal victory for children in Liberia. Now, Liberia is hailed as one of the first countries to adopt comprehensive legislation for children that is largely in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the African Charter of the Rights and Welfare of the Child. It ensures a birth registration for all children and provides ways to educate children who are living in remote areas. While celebrating and hailing Liberia's Children's Law, I want to remind all of us, especially Ambassador Mushira Khattab, that Egypt was one of the first countries to draft a children's law in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Egypt's law is now under threat. And Egypt's children's rights law should be hailed as a pioneering standard-setting instrument. And these prior gains should not be in any way eroded or tainted, but just as in Liberia, preserved, honored, celebrated. The third pivot that I would like to speak is about strengthening institutional reform in terms of formal and substantive gender equality, and in keeping with CEDAW's guarantees for temporary special measures. Article 4 of the CEDAW calls for temporary special measures or substantive equality, which means equality of result or quotas for women in order to address and combat a generation or the impact of discrimination against women. So strengthening institutional reforms in terms of quotas for women is very important in going forward. According to the IPU, in the last 5 years, post-conflict countries have featured prominently in the top 30 of the IPU's world ranking of women in national parliaments. And these countries have been effective at using quotas and reserved seats to ensure the presence and participation of women in newly created countries and institutions. Now, when I look at the transformative potential of legal and constitutional change for women's lives, and looking at how Rwanda, the only country in the world that has over 50% of women in parliament, and you look at the history of Rwanda and the journey that brought women to equal representation in parliament, you see that the 2003 constitution provides for this increase in the number of seats to be held by women in all structures of government and not just in parliament. The Senate is to have 30% of seats reserved for women, and the constitution also sets up a gender monitoring office which monitors and supervises compliance with all gender indicators and compliance with the CEDAW and other human rights guarantees. Further, Rwanda established a national system of women's councils, which are women's only councils at the grassroots level and are led by and administered by women only. Mukamuswamy, a parliamentarian in Rwanda elected through the women's councils, explains in very poignant terms the importance of this council in these terms. In the history of our country and society, women could not go in public with men. Where men were, women were not supposed to talk to show their needs. Men were to talk and think for them. So with women's councils, it has been a mobilizing tool. It has mobilized women to think of themselves and see themselves as citizens, to stand for office, to campaign, give candidates support, and to give all women support. These are pivotal words for women in the Arab Awakening too. Another important cornerstone of transitional justice and democratic governance is the need for a strong and powerful women's movement that can mobilize attention around women's rights violations. Now, once again, looking towards Rwanda and the over 50% of women in parliament in the representation of women, we see that it owes its triumphs to two trends: the use of quotas in Rwanda and the strong women's movement. In Rwanda, 3 of the 12 appointed constitutional commissioners were women. But the mere presence of women was not enough. The combined presence of women with the external pressure of the women's movement was enormously important to put pressure and to ensure the advancement of women in the constitution as well as in the legal system. Now, in some post-conflict constitution making, like in East Timor, women created their own parallel agenda to advance women's advancement so that they would not be excluded from processes and programs that were headed by men. In East Timor, the first Women's Congress in 2000 produced a platform for action for the advancement of East Timorese women, and these consultations resulted in a Women's Charter of Rights. Now, while these examples are not definitively and do not definitively prove better outcomes for women, they do underscore the necessity of making sure that women anticipate problems and create early action so that constitutional dimensions of peace agreements are not gender exclusive and ensure that women are not excluded from these processes. As Shirin Ebadi has said, the best way to prevent what happened to women in the aftermath of the Iran Revolution is to push for women's rights during the struggle right at the beginning. Don't wait for victory, she said. Choose your allies. Dictate these conditions right at the beginning. Look at Iran, she said. Do not repeat our mistakes. Did anyone say we were against polygamy, that we want divorce rights, that we are human beings and need equal rights? You are making the same mistakes Iranian women made, she said. We thought we could demand women's rights after the revolution. We all know that is now too late. So one of the ways in which we can look at this issue is by looking at the constitutional drafting process in Kenya. Despite the fact that 1325 calls for women in constitutional drafting processes and peacemaking processes, unfortunately, not a single chief peace negotiator has been a woman. But in Kenya, in the Kenyan mediation process, one of the 3 lead negotiators was a woman, Grasa Markel. And critical to the mediation was Mrs. Markel's capacity to draw her existing networks of Kenyan women. And Kenyan women played a critical role in shaping the agenda, which called for reforms to address the root causes of violence, including violence against women. And the Kenyan constitution, which was inspired by the language in the South African constitution, is very instructive to women in the Arab region. For example, drawing from inspiration from the post-apartheid constitution in South Africa, the Kenyan constitution acknowledged laws and exercises of traditions and customs. However, they ensured that these customary laws and customs must be compatible with the Constitution and international principles. And in Article 2, made sure that customary law was subordinate to the supremacy of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and international law. And it also eliminated gender discrimination in laws, customs, and practices related to economic development, including land. So I think the South African Constitution, as well as the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, are very instructive to women going forward. Finally, I have to finish with drawing focus to one of the final pieces of the toolbox, which is an overview on the terminology that must be used in constitutional drafting and legal drafting. Gendered words matter, and constitutions are rife with them. As one scholar has noted, notwithstanding the assumed reversibility of the masculine rule, it is unlikely that the use of the feminine pronoun is ever intended to embrace the masculine. For example, in the drafting of the South African Constitution, an executive decision was made by Cyril Ramaphosa to employ women and men throughout the document, even, for example, in the provisions addressing the appointment of the National Commissioner for Police Service. The point is not merely cosmetic, but subtly acknowledges that constitutional language itself functions to reorder and reconfigure society. Finally, it is important to embrace a holistic vision of inclusive security. As we saw in Egypt and in other countries in the Arab world, the fall of a dictator does not usually mean an end to violence against women, and thus the post-conflict environment is not inevitably a secure space for women. So all laws must ensure anti-violence against women. And for example, in East Timor, while increased political representation was a goal among women's groups during the transitional period, it was also viewed as a means to address women's exposure to gender-based violence, illiteracy, social and economic discrimination. So these are some of the insights, panoramic insights and snapshots that I would like to share with you. And in the final analysis, making gender central requires a vision of gender equality.
Okay.
In the rule of law.
Thank you very much. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the South African Constitution the one that also protects women who are pregnant?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, on women. And I also think the other factor that I remember from writing about it a long time ago was about the Indian quota system, where when they introduced it overnight, they empowered 1 million women in the first election, which is, quite staggering, even given India's population.
The Indian example is one of those paradigmatic examples of where the quota system really unleashed the power of women to enter politics. But since I was focusing on countries in transition and countries in post-conflict, I chose countries that were in.
I want to ask one very quick question, then open it up, because we've got a good chunk of time now for the panel to answer questions. But arguably, women are the most stereotyped in the Middle East of any place on earth because of hijab. And it's very striking that in a place like Egypt 40 years ago, you had very few women who wore hijab, whereas today the estimates are 70, 75, even 80%. My sense of it is that it is often more about identity than it is about piety. But I'd be interested in having particularly the first 3 panelists reflect on why women today are turning to hijab And in what numbers might they, just guesstimates, I guess, in the countries that you come from or have written about? Rand?
Yeah. I was very struck in 2003 when I returned to Iraq after many years to see how many women were wearing the hijab, and women who, from my own family, which has always been a very liberal, secular family, we were Muslims and so on. And there was a combination of issues. There was an increase in religiosity, and somebody mentioned that. I don't know which speaker, but there was an increase in religiosity in society, which was quite astonishing. It was in part a response, in Iraq certainly, to years of repression, to sanctions, to wars.
Or secularization?
Well, no, toward a retreat into religion, as religion being the host that could give you comfort. It wasn't a question of identity. It was a question of drawing comfort. The public domain was dangerous, and the private domain, which included your religion, which included prayer, which included solidarity, was the place where you were safe. And I think it was the safety zone that they needed. Now, in 2003, there was a lot of hijab. There was a lot of psychological pressure on women after 2003 who were not veiled to wear the veil. And I remember going into university and seeing a graffiti on the wall, saying, and a non-covered woman, a woman who is sufur, who's not covered, is a whore, basically. This is what it said on the wall of the university. There was a lot of pressure. However, since 2009 and the retreat of terrorism and the retreat of Qaeda and also the retreat of, the Mahdi army and that type of very extremist religious groups, there's been a greater liberalism in wearing the hijab and the way that women dress. So they seem to be moving away from it. The sort of feeling of general feeling of freedom and greater security is changing the ethos in society, in my view.
Thank you, Rola.
Just to add to what Rand was talking about, part of women wearing hijab is to get freedom. Because family give more freedom to their daughters when they leave the house. They can go access because she's wearing the hijab. So a lot of some women just up to wear the hijab just to get her freedom. We saw this increase in the 80s, and it's practically after the revolution of Iran, the rise of women wearing the hijab. Nowadays, you see a little bit of retreat because male want their wives to be without hijab. So then they ask their mothers who would like you to find for us a wife. They say, please get us one without hijab. So some of the restrictions, like we want one who's working because she'll have an income. Also, we want some who are. So you see this trend because of male want that. But still, for example, last year, there was college students, females, who were graduating, and I was giving them their certificate. Out of, I think, 100, there was 1 or 2 which are not veiled.
Only one or two.
Only 1 or 2, if I remember. It just was striking. It's just like I was looking, and it says, what is this? There is this social, not social pressure as much as go and get veiled. Some women, you find them getting veiled after they get married. They're unveiled, they get married, they get veiled. But the interesting phrase I heard from one of my friends who were veiled, when they're talking about this Islamization and veiled women, and she said, if my head is covered, my brain is open. Okay, so it just doesn't mean I'm a regressive person into it, because there is this notion feeling into it. The trend which Rand was talking about, nothing deals with religion. When you see our young women who are wearing the hijabs, I mean, on average, it just doesn't have to deal with religion. Half of their hair is seen,
Showing, yeah.
and you see tight jeans, colorful makeup. It's just nothing to deal with. It's becoming a fashion, okay, and the different ways of stuff like that. This is on average. I'm not saying there is. You find some women who are veiled, who are religious from a religious perspective, but it just doesn't happen to some of the women in our region. I think in the Gulf, you see them veiled in their country. You see them unveiled when they go to Europe and the West, when they travel. Just to tell you, it's not something of religious that I'm putting in, either because of pressure or family. So it's just a mix of it. But to me, it's not the issue of hijab as much as the Islamizations, the political Islamizations that's getting into our region, and how they're drifting us and regressing us is my concern now so far of it. Because women are liberated with all the fashions you see with their hijab. I mean, they're liberated from the clerks. You don't see a clerky person saying, don't wear like this. But just by putting hijab is fine for me, even if it is so much eye-catchy.
So hijab is not necessarily the reflection of the political trend. I've been struck by the number of women who wear hijab in these new fashionable, I call them the pink hijabis, because they wear bright colors. But there's one that they wear that's called the Spanish wrap, and it has a big bun at the side, and it's named after the flamenco dancer, which is. Any reflections on, you were talking about the reverse in Saudi Arabia, the fact that women are...
Well, as you know, it's widespread in Saudi that women should cover their hair, and a lot of women feel they also should cover their face, and predominantly they feel this is a religious obligation. However, among younger women, a lot of them are not covering their faces, and in fact, some cover their face in Riyadh, where it's more conservative, but when they go to Jeddah, they don't do it. And even some women have told me, my brother asked me not to cover my face. So it's getting looser there. But I think I'm going to tell you a little anecdote, which I think is very instructive. Because religion is foisted upon Saudi young people from a very early age, and the hijab is foisted on girls. I mean, it's not even foisted. They just don't grow up thinking they have a choice. There is one young woman, she's about 30 now, but she grew up in a very progressive, liberal Saudi family, this tiny, tiny, tiny minority that does exist in Saudi. And so her parents never made her wear the hijab. She only wore it because she had to when she walked out the door. So when she came to study in the States, she did not wear it. And then she and her husband and their 2 kids moved to a small town in Massachusetts. And since they had kids and she didn't like the school system in this small town, she put them in the local Islamic school at the mosque in this small town in Massachusetts. And the family got engaged in the mosque there. And she said she was just overwhelmed by the generosity, the tolerance, the family inclusion of these particular Muslims, who were mostly immigrants from Pakistan. And because the mosque became a center of the family's activities, she said, my first grader went through school the whole first year and never heard the word hell once. Whereas in Saudi schools, you hear it every day. If you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. If you don't do that, you're going to go to hell. So I'm getting to the point of my story. She decided because of that, she would voluntarily wear the hijab all the time. It became for her a sign of a new commitment to this new kind of Islam she discovered in Massachusetts. So she's now home now, and she's had her 3rd child, and she's wearing the hijab all the time.
Thank you very much. Let's begin right here. If you could identify yourself, please.
Wait, could you wait for the mic?
Wait for the mic, yeah.
Hello, my name is Maram Mikawi, and I'm a freelance writer and blogger. I'm from Saudi Arabia, but I was always also born in Britain. So regarding the hijab, this is just an additional comment. So I wear my hijab. I lived 15 years of my life in Britain. I was born there, but I chose to, wear the hijab because it's in my religion. I have a degree in computer science, a PhD in computer science. So like you said, I cover my head, but it doesn't mean that my brain is covered. Regarding the...
Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's a comment and a question.
I need a question.
Okay, then I'll have to start with a comment, which leads to a question.
I tell you what, let's do the question.
Okay. The question then will be to the first two speakers. I see a lot of women, Arab women activists. They always present women right in a way that it's like against Islam, like it's the Islamist or the political Islam is against women right. And even if you really don't mean that, but this is what people perceive listening to what you say. I think one of the problems...
we really need to go to the question. There are a lot of people who have questions.
Okay, so the question is, why do you think, if a lot of women, you were saying regarding women in Iraq, they don't mind women being ministers because it doesn't touch Sharia, but when it comes to other issues...
What is your question?
Yes, my question is, why do you think is that? Why do you think would they have a problem, a lot of women, even educated women, have a problem with women right, although they are women? Why do you think is the reason that they would be against their own rights? That's my question.
First of all, let me just be clear, and because the time is short, one can't really speak too long. I don't happen to think that Islam itself is against women. And I think Lilia mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, that Islam is always interpreted by men. I think the issue, and I'm sorry to apologize to all the men here, I'm sure you're wonderful, upstanding citizens. I think we have a serious problem of male chauvinism in the interpretation of Islam. It's the men who interpret it in their favor in order to retain power and control. And that is, period, full stop. Even the issue of polygamy. And when they say, and I'm not going to read to you the surah, but what the surah says in the Quran is that you are not going to be fair. If you are fair, but you will never be fair. Therefore, you cannot practice polygamy. Now, the men read only the first half. The men read only the first half of that surah and never bother to talk about the second half. So, Islam is not... Now, there are issues in Islam, and I don't want to exonerate Sharia and the religion, because the Quran also says you can beat them. Men can beat their wives or their women. And some scholars say, well, it means you beat them gently. You don't harm them. Well, any kind of beating is not allowed. Okay? So I don't want to say that Islam is absolutely neutral or doesn't have things that harm women, but it is not nearly as much as what men interpret. Okay. Now, why are some women in the Iraqi parliament, for example, I think partly because they are intimidated, because they are brainwashed, because they belong to religious parties and they came on the wave of arriving religious parties. In other words, they came with those religious parties and they cannot go against their party line. This is normal, by the way, in all, perhaps only in the US, but if you look at the British system, if you belong to the Labour Party, by golly, you vote with the Labour Party. So, and it's the same in Iraq. If you belong to this particular party, it is very difficult to go against your party parameters. So those I think are some of the reasons.
Any other comments?
Big subject.
I'll just add, we're not discussing religion now. We're just discussing group of people, they're using religion, Islam, political Islamizations to get into power. And unfortunately, this group of people, yes, they see the role of women is in the private spheres, full stop. And if they want to extend to become very moderate, you just do work and traditional work. And now we're seeing also to see much more, I didn't speak about it, we're seeing not domestic violence, we're seeing economic violence. Now, I take your salary and I'll give you a stipend further. And this is fine for them. This is how the role of women, but just to get her. And I think the other thing is women, when you say women from this political Islamization, why they're against women issues? Because they're thinking the role of women is only in the private sphere. This is what they've been raised. Public sphere is men's job. So the man will take care of me. The man will do everything. This is how they've been raised. So the relationship between a woman and the state, instead of becoming direct relationship like the man and the state, we need to have a middleman who is your guardian. So it's either your father or your husband. So there is no straight relationship between you and the state. You want to issue a passport, your husband or your father has to issue it for you. You want to get married, you have to get their permission. So this is what we're talking about. The role that they've been raised on from their political Islamization is not the role we see for women. You want to have this, but you don't have to generalize it to every single woman. And I just make it like this. An extremist Islamist can live in a secular, civil societies. A secular liberal person cannot live in an Islamist societies. Just the freedoms are limited. Freedoms are limited. There you have every freedom. I can have tolerance. There you don't have tolerance. There is a limitation for tolerance.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. The bottom line, which I've come to believe after studying this issue for many years, is choice, personal choice. In secular ideology, if there is one, choice exists, and it's an assumption on which all the other ideas are made. In the Islamist perspective, not Islam, but in the Islamist perspective, everybody's got to conform to their particular interpretation of Islam. So choice is non-existent or very limited.
I just would add one thing on Ren's point, and that is, I think, one of the most interesting trends in the region today are the number of women who are reinterpreting the Quran, whether they are people like Fatima Mernissi in Morocco, who's was one of the first Arab feminists, but in every country that I have visited in the region, and that's all of them, there are, whether it's a pocket here or there, whether it's classes that are being taught now at mosque, that you find women energized to say, okay, the men have interpreted Islam throughout the centuries, and it's our turn. We need to go back to the very beginning, not just to modernize what is being, and trying to adapt as is, going all the way back to the 7th century, which is really interesting. Didi.
My name is Didi Cutler, and I have lived in Saudi Arabia. I just wanted to go back to a comment that Carol Murphy said about the women drivers, because there was a group of women drivers during the Iraq war, and the Saudis were very upset about it because they thought the women were putting their own wills and ambitions above the country, and their passports were taken away, they were punished, they were fired from their jobs, and it took 2 years for them to get back to normal. So are you attributing the more gentle punishments now to an evolution into King Abdullah?
Absolutely, absolutely. And nobody, after that demonstration in 1990, then the Mufti issued a fatwa banning women from driving. So I don't recall the exact wording of it. I don't know if he said Islam forbids this, but he basically said we're not going to let women drive. Today, nobody argues in Saudi Arabia that women driving is against Islam. They say it's against our culture, it's against our tradition, but they don't argue anymore because they know it's so false and ridiculous that driving is against Islam. So definitely there's been an evolution in thinking.
Let's go to the man in the back. Usually in audiences I'm saying, where are the women's questions?
Good morning. My name is Joshua Polachek from the State Department. First, just a quick comment that when we're talking about Islamists, we should note that no political force in the Arab world is empowering women, whether you're talking about nationalists or seculars. Even in Tunisia, it's dominated by 2 secular parties and an Islamist party, and those 2 secular parties are led by men. There were not a single secular party in Tunisia or Morocco nominated a woman to be minister. My question, though, is you speak about modernity. Why do you think modernity has lost its force within the Arab world as an ideology? It seemed very prevalent. I saw pictures when I was living in Mosul and in Tunisia and Islamabad of life in the 50s and 60s. Why do you think that this ideology, which calls for citizenship, a political citizenship, why do you think that has lost its hold in the Arab and wider Islamist world?
Can I make the
Yeah,
comment?
let me just make, I want to say one thing first, right of the chair. It depends on how you define modernity. I think one of the things that's interesting is that the majority of women in the region really want to be very much part of the 21st century, and that's reflected in the fact that the majority of women in the two most repressive Muslim societies, Iran and Saudi Arabia, the majority of university students are female. So, we always, and this has been the argument for decades, confuse modernity with westernization. And so I think you may be treading, but let's hear what others have to say. Rola, you want to take that one first?
I'll say, if people will look why modern liberal people didn't win in elections after this revolution. My notion was this: liberals, and we have to rethink, liberals always throughout the decades were spreading ideology, were never looked into their mandate to control and be in power. While Islamists, their thinking is, I want to be in power. When you think you want to be in power, you do something different when you want to spread ideology. You just go and work within civil service, you help people, you do whatever it takes because you get them aligned to you so that you get their votes. So, and I think now liberals have to rethink that we need to be in power and work whatever requires to be in power in terms of serving people so that you get the votes of them. We're spreading ideology. And that's why you always find the liberals are not speaking to the grassroots very much. They're not because we never thought be in power. That's my perception why we lost. We weren't in power, so you keep on saying rights and stuff. Everybody adheres to it. But when you want to get a vote, it's a totally different ballgame for people to get votes.
Rand had something to add? Rand, you had something to add?
Well, now that everybody's clapping, I'm not sure I should disagree with Rula, but I will go ahead and disagree. Rula, I'm sorry to disagree with you. I think liberals or modernizers, I think actually the right word is modernizers, were in power. If you look at all the regimes that have been toppled, Zain al-Abidin, Hosni Mubarak.
These are not the liberals we're talking about.
No, I'm sorry.
These are military people.
Just a second.
They weren't liberal, but they were modernizers.
They were modernizers. And they were, unfortunately, secular in the sense that they were not in Islamist parties, they were not enforcing Sharia, or they were not interested in enforcing Sharia. And I think that there is now a stigma associated with modernizers because they're also seen as the corrupt, the authoritarian, the dictatorial, the torturers, blah, blah, blah. The people who robbed the state, they were the rentier, and so on and so forth. And so modernism became completely identified with these modernizing regimes that really did very little for the mass of the people, but maybe did a little bit for a very small elite of the population. And their coterie did very well, but as Lilia said, you go out 60 miles out of Tunis, and where was the modernizing going on? Nowhere. Iraq, the same thing, Egypt, I'm sure. So there is a stigmatization of the modernity, not because the liberals didn't want to get to power. And I want to add another thing, because Iraq really, and I would encourage, and I know this is very solipsistic, but I would encourage people to look at Iraq in the last 19 years. We've been through cycles. And today, in 2011, 2012, modernity has become a little more acceptable. And I wouldn't call it modernity in terms of westernization. The youth in Iraq today are very globalistic. They want to globalize themselves. They want to be part of a globalist community. And I'm not just talking about the emo that we read about, but whether it's girls at universities and boys and in the villages and in the small towns and so on. There's a great desire to be part of the world. And I think we had a 2003, 2004, we had a backlash from the Islamists and the tribals, and then we had, intimidation. And now we're beginning to see a little bit of, outward-looking sense coming from the youth. And I think this is very important, and we shouldn't miss these cyclical journeys that our countries are going through, and I'm sure the Arab Awakening countries will also go through.
Modernization means something different in a globalizing world than it did at the end of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah. Right here in the back.
Hi, my name's Margaret Rogers, and I will be joining the State Department shortly, going to Afghanistan. The topic is the Arab Awakening marginalizing women? And we heard the answer is yes. I want to hear a lot more about why, and I'd like Dola to start because you gave some really great explicit examples of this, including using the social segregation phrase.
I went further. It's not marginal. I'm worried about exclusion into it. You see, the problem is, where is the role of women within society? We never settled this issue. At least in our society, there's a huge debate. Still, the issue is private sphere, public sphere. Within society and within political Islamization, women are in private sphere, full stop. And if they want to engage the public sphere, as I said before, it's just in the labor market and specific jobs in labor market. Don't tell me an engineer going into sites, but tell me as a teacher, because the schools are segregated. So she's mingling with same sex. This is how far we go into the issue. And everything else becomes male jobs. And you see it in our curriculum, the education curriculum. When they portray a woman, it's the mother who's cooking, who's cleaning the house, who's raising the kids. The father who's working is going out. So it's reinstating the issue of role of women within society. And this is why you see it also in her rights as a citizen. So you're not a citizen because there is a male guardian for you, irrespective of what age you are in. In Kuwait, for example, with the family law now, if you're a divorcee at an age of 50 and you want to get remarried, you have to have your guardian to approve it to that extent. Or otherwise, you don't get married. And we're having problems now because some of them have inheritance. So the brothers will bargain into this. Give us part of the inheritance, we'll approve your marriage. Okay? So when political Islamization comes, and they know society haven't settled this, it becomes an issue to use. So whenever you don't deliver on issues that mandates within citizens in terms of employment, in terms of better livelihood, you will throw women issue. You start speaking about segregation, any issue resulting in women, because you will drift society. This is a play they will always do. They did it in Kuwait, they will do it in Egypt, they will do it in every place. When you fail to deliver, you will engage society with something that polarizes them. And women is a quick way to polarize society in our region. Whether it was schooling segregation, whether women at work, whether at political rights, you just get whether women will get her license to drive, whether it was getting her passport. Nowadays, we as women had to go to the Constitution Court to get a ruling from the Constitution so that the woman can issue her passport without getting her father or her husband approval. Okay? And we get the ruling. Although it's going, still sometimes the Ministry of Interior will ask for the father, although we have a ruling. But where we get it from the Constitution, because our Constitution is a liberal Constitution. Okay? But we have a problem. citizens cannot go directly to the Constitutional Court. It's a lower court, and it's a problem. So in countries where we had regimes, repressive regimes, but were open, liberal in thinking that they gave some rights to women into it, it's a problem because these rights are going to be taken away. The first thing they will be doing is they will take away these rights. Okay, you will find a revisiting of family laws. Wait for them, and they will find the revisiting of the family laws. Wait a little bit, and you will find the issue of the nationality of women can give her husband, her sons, the nationality. Wait until these countries that have a revolution, for example, wait until you will see a revisiting, or this issue will be, because women giving a nationality to her kid is against religion, because it's a blood, and the blood of the male is more important than the blood of female.
Can I? Lydia has a question, but I want to take this question and ask Rangita something. One of the Arab uprisings created the forces of change in an Islamic context, but there is a broader trend, and that is in Eastern Europe after the demise of communism, women did terribly. They were in Romania, they went from something like 40 to 3% of parliament, that across the board, democracy was terrible for women compared with communism, socialism, which, women were the proletariat as were men. Can you look at how women have done, given the kind of global change we've seen with the demise of apartheid and minority rule in Africa, end of military dictatorships in Latin America? Do you see a bigger trend for how women have done to put what's happened in the Arab world in context?
I'm so glad that you brought up the whole issue of Eastern Europe, because Swanee Hunt started the Vital Voices program because of the ways in which women's voices were excluded in the aftermath of the demise of communism, and the ways in which women's positions and status deteriorated, and women were far worse off after the demise of communism than before that, despite the fact that, during communism also there was the way in which there was in the Arab countries the state feminism and state-led feminism, but that was mere lip service, and it only touched the very small percentage of women. So I'm very glad, because there are those lessons that we can still draw from women in the communist world that parallel the experiences of women in the Arab Spring, that their positions deteriorated, and there needed to be this enormous effort on the part of women themselves to mobilize, galvanize, and network, and create non-governmental organizations and a women's movement that paralleled state structures. And I think that's what Swanee Hunt also refers to in what she calls in her essay in Foreign Affairs, where she refers to the cost of exclusion. The cost of exclusion of women in Eastern Europe resulted in the cost of exclusion in development, cost of exclusion in the rule of law. And women created these parallel structures that to some extent mimicked what was going on in the state sector, but that was not enough. Women organizing informally is not the same as women organizing within the public sphere. And sometimes it is almost, it diminishes women because of the fact that it creates this kind of parallel worlds, two states, as Lilia mentioned so evocatively, and once again reinforces all those stereotypes of women being fit to serve in the private sphere. Even though the NGO space is a public sphere, it's still not at the level of decision making. And I think that's a very important point to remember, that women leading non-governmental organizations is not the same thing as women leading ministries, agencies, and decision-making processes.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. Lilia, we'll end where we began.
Thank you very much, because you are giving me the time to speak. I would like to ask you, I have a fear that we will live with something that it is homogenization in everywhere, in every country, between the all countries, and the Arab world. This is a danger, I think. Don't you think that it is a danger? Second one, what could be the role of the media in this part? Because we heard that there is a fatwa in Saudi Arabia recently, 10 days ago, about women not having the right to go on internet by themselves. They have to be accompanied by men, etc., etc. What do you think? We are hearing about this. What could be, how we can challenge this kind of information on the media, etc., etc.?
Carol, do you want to take the media question?
Sure. I really think that the media plays a big role in this. And I think that women in all these countries have to learn how to use the media. And, you know, the bad news is that as far as the American media goes, we've lost a lot of foreign correspondents who live in these countries and understand them and report back. On the other hand, the situation has created opportunities for freelancers to go there. And so there's no excuse for not having these countries covered. But people who are working for women's rights have to learn who are the national and foreign media and take advantage of them. Yeah, plays a big role.
I was struck on some Secretary of State's trip when we were in Saudi Arabia, the number of female journalists who were at a press conference covering,
yeah, but most of them cover female issues.
But they were covering the visit of an American Secretary of State, which
maybe it's because she was a female.
I don't think it was Condi. I think it was Powell. I can't remember. I mean, but I've been there a number of times.
In general, there are very few women in powerful positions in the Saudi media, which in any event is all government controlled.
Yeah. I'm told that we actually have time for a couple more questions. So,
I want to talk about the homogeneity. Did you mean that we're trying to make all the countries in the region the same? We're not. We are very distinctive. We have different histories, different experiences. And when I say, for example, we're going to talk, Iraq is a good case study, not because we're identical, but because there are certain elements that may recur. But I do not think, for example, that the situation in Iraq is similar to the one in Egypt by any means, nor to the one in Tunisia by any means. I mean, we all have our own characteristics, but there are certain common elements, and one of them is the fact that there are increasingly Islamist parties coming into power. There's increasingly a more conservative climate, and increasingly women's rights are jeopardized. These are certainly common elements that we should, but there's no sense of homogeneity at all.
Robin, may I respond to a question that she asked about why is it that women who come into decision making and come into power still are hostile to women's rights? And I just want to clarify that that is not endogenous or unique just to countries in the Arab region, that happens across the world, that there are women who are there in power because of their relationship to the political party, or because of their relationship to a male member who is in politics, have nothing to do with the women's movement, and are not in any way directly accountable to the women who have brought them into power. And I think I want to refer back to your question about the panchayat system in India that brought million women to power. Now, when they first came to power, the face of women was not gender sensitive. These were not women who had training in gender sensitivity, and they were there because of their relationship to a male politician or a male member in the community. But over time, as politics changed, you found that more women ran for office because of their interest and their commitment to women and to the community, and the whole culture changed. So I think it is important to see that women are not only gender sensitive and they're not just there because of a quota, but because of the fact that they represent women and their constituencies, but also to say that over time, you say that there is this role model effect, that more and more when women see themselves in office, younger women who are more prepared to run for office start running.
Back in the middle. Sure.
Cora Newman, U.S. State Department. Sorry for dominating. I just wanted to ask a question about whether and how women are able to support each other across borders, and whether there have been some lessons or anecdotes about women's groups working to support each other, across the region in terms of political and economic empowerment.
We actually should let Hale answer that question, since she sponsors a lot of these groups meeting and networking with women. But
there is a lot of network going on. I was telling a friend, I don't know if she's still here, I think personally, irrespective now who adores or hates George Bush and his policies, I think part of the revolution, the awakening you see today, the U.S. policy at that time about democratization, about civil society rights, about women empowerment, we're beneficiary of it, the revolution. And from that time, at that time, nobody knew about civil societies, at least in our region. And if there is very low profile, there was a lot of investment in networking with them through MEPI, through a lot of think tanks in the US, in the West, in Europe. Okay, there was a lot of funding which went through this. So there were a lot of civil society empowerment. There was a lot of social activist and political activist networking that we learned from each other, and we spoke to each other. So you know what worked, what didn't work, and you keep in touch with it. And there was an empowerment itself, individual empowerment. And the same thing, the voices, when you start to raise the human rights voices, the political change, the reforms issues, if it was on economic and political. So these investments that has been done throughout the last 10 years, it became a beneficiary, and it helped a lot of the awakening that you saw and social movements that you saw within our societies. So we still continue on it. Yes, it's interesting that the region is in a revolution at a time the world is bankrupt. Okay, so it's unfortunate. Countries, the West, and everybody is in economic turmoil. So you don't get the benefit also, like other regions when they had the revolution, the world a little bit wealthier, stuff like that.
You should thank God.
I don't know. It is so it becomes it's the interaction. We're talking about global systems, at least in it. So we are working now because of the IT. The networking becomes you get the conferences, video conferences, or stuff like that. So it becomes cheaper also to meet and play. But there is meetings going on. It's unfortunate. I say it, when President Obama gave his speech in Cairo, I was one of the people who were very frustrated on the speech. Okay, among a lot of people were raising it, praising it. I was among the very few people who were very frustrated because I found out in the speech, 5-page speech or whatever it is, 5 times he spoke about democracy, 5 times, but mentioned the word democracy, and he diluted and discounted women issues to women, small businesses. It was so frustrating. If you want to sell the region on democracy and it's not important, but don't sell it so cheap. Okay, that was and I made my point in the meetings with the embassies and stuff like that. So we don't need to dissect and dilute our rights by having small businesses and women's small businesses and grants and stuff like that. It's much more. We're citizens who wants to be part shaping our societies, and we want to have the opportunity to shape it. As we shaped the revolution, we were part of it, and you saw all walk of women. So we need to have the opportunity for all of walk of women to reach their aspiration, whatever their aspiration. She wants to stay at home, fine. She wants to become a president, fine. But let's have these choices there for the women to participate in her society, and that's what we're working for.
I want to thank you all, first of all, for coming. Please join me in thanking Rend and Rola and Carol and Rangita.